to the next session of our course on nuclear security. I hope you can hear me okay. This is Michael Nacht. Professor Van Bibber can't be online right now because of a faculty meeting. But Mansuk and Austin are here. And we're very pleased to have a very special guest lecturer, George Moore. George Moore has an amazing background in every way. Starting educationally, he's a graduate of the Naval Academy. He then received a law degree at UC Berkeley School of Law. It used to be called Bolt Hall until recently. And then went on to get a master's and PhD in nuclear engineering at UC Berkeley. So this is what you guys have to look forward to. He's worked in a lot of areas on nuclear weapons, weapons effects, nuclear security, legal instruments for nuclear security, and also in the cyber area. There's a lot more to his background I'm going to skip over, but most importantly for our purposes, from 2007 to 2012, he was a senior analyst in the Office of Nuclear Security at the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, where he worked on the Incident and Trafficking Database and served as scientific secretary for the Director General's Advisory Group on Nuclear Security. He's also served as scientific secretary for the development of the agency's Fundamental of Nuclear Security document. He's a former scholar, Fulbright scholar in the Netherlands, a former Atomic Energy Special Fellow, a licensed professional engineer. He's been a research reactor operator. He's been a practicing attorney. He's been admitted to the bars in California and Colorado, and a number of federal circuit and district court bars and the US Supreme Court bar. So he's just got a tremendous wealth of experience. I think he's going to spend much of the time here talking about safeguards and the ability of the IAEA to determine whether countries are complying with the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty. So I think you have the slides up, Origins of International Safeguards, and I'll turn it now over to Dr. Moore, who I should mention has been since 2012 a senior scholar, scientist in residence at the Middlebury Institute for International Studies, which has a major nuclear nonproliferation effort, and some of the best minds in the world are there, including Dr. Moore. George, welcome.
Well, thank you for that over extravagant introduction. Let me just say, because I can't see people, usually, you know, when you talk in person, you get some feedback visually from whether people are nodding off or, you know, anxious to ask a question. So let me ask you that, you know, keep your systems on mute, but when you want to ask a question, just jump in and ask a question and we'll deal with it as we go along. As Michael said, you know, my background is basically two things, science and also the law. So maybe we can talk a little bit about each of those. I think Mansuk has a document that he'll provide you, published something yesterday in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists on the coronavirus and its potential impacts on the JCPOA, the agreement with Iran. And maybe we can talk about that, you know, assuming we have time. So I want to talk, well, let's see here. Got to get onto the right. Points we'll cover today. We're going to talk about the history of safeguards. We're going to talk about, and I want you to understand that there are a number of safeguards regimes. People seem to think of this as a monolith. People seem to think of it as a regime that only deals with NPT, countries that have the NPT in place, the Nonproliferation Treaty. You'll see that that's not true. But keep in mind throughout this that safeguards is, to some extent, just an accounting system. It's an inspection system, but it's also an accounting system. It is a system where the IAEA keeps track of nuclear material, and we'll talk about what that means because there are a lot of different definitions of nuclear material, keeps track of nuclear material within a member state. And to ensure that these materials are not diverted for nuclear weapons use. Note that military use is allowed. When you look at the NPT, some people say, well, this is a loophole that military use is allowed. It's actually a very conscious decision on the framers of the NPT because they didn't want the NPT to cover things like nuclear submarines, didn't want things to be covered such as, reactors that might be flown in space, etc. So we'll talk about all those things. And we start out back kind of at the beginning, and we start with the International Atomic Energy Agency, which was not the beginning. I'm sorry, this slide is out of order. It's not the beginning. Let me go to the next slide, which I think will be the beginning, and we'll come back to the IAEA organization structure. I apologize for that. World War II ended, 1945. We'd used, obviously, atomic bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. US is the only nuclear power. United Nations was formed, but that was actually formed before the war ended. Anybody know where it was formed?
San Francisco.
Yeah, San Francisco. So, you can go over and see historically where the UN started. The idea was to replace and correct the deficiencies in the defunct League of Nations. One of the big deficiencies was that the US didn't participate in the League of Nations. And one of the big problems that they felt they needed to address was how can atomic energy and nuclear weapons be controlled? There wasn't any real concept at that time about the peaceful uses of atomic energy. That came more or less in 1953 with Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace speech. So what they formed was the United Nations Atomic Energy Commission. It was founded in 46 by Resolution 1 of the UN General Assembly. Established a commission to deal with the problems raised by nuclear weapons. The UNAEC you've probably never heard of because it became defunct in 1952. What happened historically was that the Soviet Union basically blocked everything that was attempted by the UNAEC. There were several things that came out, and one of the things was that the terms of reference for the UNAEC, we're talking 1946, was the first place where you have a reference to safeguards. And here is can people see when I use my pointer on screen? Mensa, can you see my pointer moving around? Okay, good. Yeah. So if you look down here, subparagraph D of this first resolution, for effective safeguards by way of inspection and other means protect complying states against hazards of violations and evasions. That's an early concept of safeguards. And although the UNAEC was pretty much non-functional, if you go back and you look at the Baruch plan, proposed that the US deal with its weapons, get rid of them. If there was a veto-proof UN controls that could ensure peaceful use only, was passed by the UNAEC. That concept was passed, but was blocked by the Soviet Union in the UN Security Council. Any of the major members of the Security Council can veto anything. So, although the UNAEC was disbanded, it arguably is the precursor for the IAEA. The idea being that the IAEA was created to become an effective replacement for the ineffective UNAEC. Notice the term is the same. I mean, up until, oh, I guess it was the 70s, you know, all our nuclear things, nuclear weapons, nuclear reactors, and everything nuclear in the United States was under the Atomic Energy Commission, which was split up then. People felt, particularly in the wake of 3 Mile Island and other things, might have actually occurred before then, but there was a feeling that it was bad to have an agency which promoted the use of nuclear power and at the same time tried to regulate it. So the AEC was split into the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and what you now know as Department of Energy. Went through a couple of name changes, but now it's Department of Energy. So in the United States, the NRC regulates nuclear matters, except for those things that are actually regulated by the Department of Energy. Some reactors owned by the Department of Energy are under self-regulation by the Department of Energy. And the Department of Energy is a developer and promoter of a lot of concepts in nuclear energy. If you're on Facebook or something, you may see daily that they've become much more aggressive in the last maybe 6 months, Department of Energy, in putting up, I wouldn't call them propaganda, but they're, well, maybe they are propaganda. They're pronouncements about the beneficial effects of nuclear power. There'll be things about modular reactors, things like that. Anyway, so what you have then, you know, at least by 1948, when Churchill makes his speech about the Iron Curtain, the Cold War becomes a controlling feature of international diplomacy. UK goes nuclear in 52. Of course, the Soviets go nuclear in 49. Atoms for Peace, 1953, a big change. IAEA actually is created in 1957. France goes nuclear in 1960. China goes nuclear in 64. The NPT goes into effect in 1970, but it had about a 3 or 4 year creation phase when it was developed. So this is kind of backdrop in history. And let me go back and pick up this slide that I somehow had out of order. We get in 1957, we get the International Atomic Energy Agency. You need to understand that this is an independent organization. The membership of the IAEA is not the same as the membership of the UN. The UN has more members. It has its own Director General, and I guess one of the reasons the slide was out of order, maybe I may have a newer version, because the Director General is no longer Yukio Amano. He unfortunately died maybe 6 months ago. The new Director General is Rafael Grossi from Argentina. And Grossi actually was the deputy to Amano for a couple of years. The way the IAEA is structured, under the Director General are various departments. And the three major departments, biggest, and we'll call it the 800-pound gorilla at the IAEA, is safeguards. It has the most people, it has the most budget, it has the most force in effect. There's also technical cooperation. This is the other half of the kind of promise of the NPT, being that we should provide, in return for countries giving up their access to nuclear weapons, the weapon states should provide peaceful information to the non-nuclear weapon states, assist them in developing things like nuclear power, etc. And that's the subject of the Department of Technical Cooperation at the agency. TC is a big department, not as much budget, but worldwide reach, and provides courses, training, brings people to Vienna, goes out and does training in the field, and they cover a lot of different types of things. If you might be sterilizing fruit flies in some country, using radiation, be an example. At one point, I think one of the few things that I was really proud of, well, I shouldn't say it that way. I was proud of a lot of the things I did at the IAEA, but at one point, people came from Nepal who were not, Nepal at that time was not an IAEA member. And they were sure that up in a remote valley, they had cattle which were suffering from radiation sickness because they knew something about radiation. They had some Geiger counters, and the sick cows were laying on the ground. And when they put the radiation counters on the sick cows, they got a higher reading than they did on the healthy cows, which were standing up. Of course, those of you who are technical probably realize that they were reading the difference in background level as a function of distance from the ground, which in fact they were. It turned out I went back to try and help them. I found that our technical cooperation people had actually some veterinarians. They got involved. We got people from Davis involved. And we found out that the cows were suffering from malnutrition. And this was an area where you could only get into it about 6 months of the year. And we were able to save a bunch of cows. Their cow is not the appropriate term. They're kind of a yak-like cattle. Anyway, that's pretty much a digression. But technical cooperation. The safety and security is the other big department. And then the others are more minor, like human relations and that sort of thing. In safety and security is most of the technical expertise, both in safety aspects and in security aspects. Safety has been a long-time player. Security is rather a post 9/11 feature of the agency. There was also a long, protracted battle about whether security was a proper function of the IAEA. If you read the statute of the IAEA, which is not a very long document, you can get a hold of it and read it, you will not find any reference at all to security. The word security or any of the equivalents doesn't appear there. This is compounded by some of the IAEA languages which don't have a separate word for safety and security. So a number of states complained that when the IAEA launched into doing nuclear security, that they were operating outside this charter of the agency. Primary among those was Argentina. Remember I said Dr. Grossi came from Argentina. Those arguments by Argentina were loud and often at the Board of Governors level until Grossi was appointed as the deputy to Amano. And that seemed to calm down all the arguments about whether security was a proper function or not. So we've got the IAEA, we've got the NPT. Let's go back to where we were here. 57, it's put into place, and it's a separate body. It reports, the Director General reports to the UN Security Council. He does not report to the general, locking on the term right now, but the General Assembly of the UN. The way the IAEA does its business is it's controlled by a Board of Governors. And the Board of Governors is a little bit like this UN Security Council. It has permanent members and it has floating members. Typically, one of the floating members is the chair of the Board of Governors. The floating members rotate every, oh gosh, I think it's every 4 years, but I could be wrong on that. It could be 2 years. And they set the policy. Every September, there's a meeting of the General Assembly of the IAEA where all the countries come if they want to, and they hear the reports from the Board of Governors, and essentially they can overrule the Board of Governors, but that would be an exceptional thing, and I don't think that's ever been done. Basically, they rubber stamp what the Board of Governors do. Sometimes they have questions and sometimes things get changed, but rarely would, I can't think of a situation where they said, no, Board of Governors, you've done the wrong thing and we don't want this to happen. But the agency works on a principle of consensus. And we'll talk about that later, because basically what you have to get anything done by the Secretariat is you have to have a consensus of the member states. And that can be quite difficult to achieve. Going back to the statute of the IAEA, Article 3 authorizes the establishment of safeguards and to apply them at the request of parties to an international instrument or to the request of a state. And this becomes interesting because the IAEA then is authorized to apply safeguards if there's an international treaty that calls for safeguards. You could say the JCPOA falls into that context. Arguably it doesn't. And there are a lot of differences between regular safeguards and what's being done under the JCPOA. Let's go on here. Article 12 sets up the safeguard program and inspectors. So there were inspectors, a handful, at the IAEA starting in 1957. Now they have a lot of inspectors, but still not very big in terms of the overall scheme of things. The way the IAEA does its business is it issues information circulars. These are referred to as INFCIRCs, INFCIRC. And so INFCIRC 26 in 1961 established safeguards for research, test, and power reactors less than 100 megawatts thermal. And it was established in 1967 before the NPT. So there are safeguards in effect in non-NPT countries, for example, India, at designated facilities where they've been there since the late 1960s. And this is important to understand because it is, you need to understand that there are these different regimes. They're all controlled by different INFCIRCs. There's another type of document which we may run into later that is issued by the IAEA, and it's called a GovInf, and it comes from the Board of Governors itself. The INFCIRCs come as a total agency product. GovInf are documents just from the Board of Governors. So safeguards obviously predates the NPT. When the NPT went into effect, the non-nuclear weapon states had to reach an agreement pursuant to INFCIRC 540, I think it's 153, I'm sorry, 153, 540 is model protocol. INFCIRC 153, let me go back here. All the states that were signatories to the NPT had to establish separate agreements with the IAEA. State party information about the agreements, I looked at one time and I could only find one open agreement which you could find easily on the web. These agreements and the information that's collected by safeguards is considered classified. It is not accessible by anyone other than people in the safeguards department. People from technical cooperation, people from nuclear security, people from nuclear safety, they do not have access to safeguards information. There may be a request made by safeguards to the country that about their information, asking if they could release it to other parts of the agency, but that's very rare. When I was in nuclear security, we had several things where, for example, a country would discover some material, or some material would come in and scrap into that country. This is an added gain under safeguards. So safeguards wanted all the information that I had about it, and they would not give me any information in return, even though we were actually part of some of the safeguards network. So you have to understand that there are these, it's not all one big happy family. Safeguards kind of runs on its own. And that is a very strict mandate. And the information is closely held by safeguards. Having said that, when you go to work at the IAEA, you sign a confidentiality agreement with the IAEA. And that allows you to have access to whatever documents and information you are cleared to have. You are not supposed to, give that to your country. Sometimes countries come and knock on your door, not in your office in the agency, but at your home or your apartment or whatever, and say, we'd really like to know what you're doing about this or that. And that becomes a little testy because you have to say, I'm sorry, I can't give you that information because I signed this agreement with the IAEA. Obviously, some people do give up that information, and it's considered that most information is leaked to intelligence agencies from people from their countries. It's unfortunate in a way, but it's actually true. You won't see that publicly stated, you won't see that in public documents, but that's generally the feeling at the agency. So we get then to INFCIRC 153. This is the document that sets forth what agreements the non-nuclear weapon states under the NPT have to have with the agency. And this is referred to as comprehensive safeguards. This term comes up when you deal, for example, with the Nuclear Suppliers Group. This is a group of countries that produce reactors, things that would be useful potentially in any nuclear program. And although it's not a mandate, the Nuclear Suppliers Group more or less commits to not providing information and hardware to countries which do not have INFCIRC 153 in place. The major exception to that, and if you were to talk to Dr. Potter, who's our center director, he would say that this is a stab in the heart of the NPT, was when the US agreed to an exchange, what we call a 123 agreement under our Atomic Energy Act with India. Of course, Pakistan would like to have the same deal. And it undercut a lot of things because India is not an NPT member. It does not have INFCIRC 153 safeguards in place. Inspectors are not. They do have older safeguards regimes in place, and they do cooperate with the IAEA. They're an IAEA member, but so is Pakistan. IAEA membership and NPT membership are obviously very different. Well, not very different. They're countries that are IAEA members which are not members of the NPT. So you've got the first couple of parts of the regime. You have the INFCIRC 60, earlier 26 or 66, I always get the numbers confused. You've got 153, and 153 was what was around up until the time of the first Gulf War. And then actually the second Gulf War, we had, let's just go back and stay consistent with the slides. I don't want to get too far ahead. What does safeguards cover? It has its own terminology. It doesn't say nuclear material. It talks about special fissionable material and source material. These are set out in Article 20, XX, or Corona, or whatever you want to, I guess, Dos Equis, XX, in the statute of the IAEA. Basically, special fissionable material is what back in 1957 people thought would be the useful materials for making a nuclear weapon. And source material was the material from which that type of material could be created. For example, special fissionable material covers basically all the uraniums, plutoniums, etc., in any kind of enrichment form for the uranium and in any form for the plutonium. Source material includes, for example, depleted uranium, and it also includes thorium and some other minor aspects. There are materials from which you could build potentially a nuclear weapon which are not covered as either special fissionable material or source material. But everyone is loath to go back and change the statute. It is also true that the types of materials, for example, Neptunium 237, they're very rare. The weapons states would not build a device with that because they build things out of highly enriched uranium and plutonium. And other than the weapon states, and only a few of the weapon states at that, would have access to any kind of significant amounts or significant quantities, and that's a special term under the IAEA definition, which we'll talk about maybe in a minute. They would not build weapons for this, even though there are maybe, I don't know, 20 or 25 materials, radionuclides that exist which have a critical mass that can be calculated or has been measured for that material. Anytime you can have a critical mass of a material, that means you can make a weapon out of it somehow, maybe a terribly bad weapon, but if it's fissile, and I'm sure you've probably gone over the definition of what's fissile and what's fissionable. If it's fissile and has a critical mass, potentially you can make a weapon out of it. So those are not covered. You really need to read Article 20 to understand exactly what's covered. So 153 established a system of accounting and control. That's the bookkeeping aspect. What happened under 153 is each state then had to declare what nuclear material it had, what things it had that was covered by Article 20. I'll use nuclear material as a generic term to cover that. And then the IAEA verified the declarations by inspection. Now, obviously, this could have been subject to a tremendous amount of mischief on behalf of a state, because 153 was still primarily tied to declared facilities. What Iran did in avoiding, Iran had a 153 agreement. Iran failed to declare facilities. This is where they got in trouble with the IAEA. But what they were doing, had they declared them, had they declared the facilities, had they declared the centrifuge plants, the Natanz, were not a violation of the NPT. Enrichment is not a violation of the NPT. Countries can enrich. Countries can enrich all the way up to weapons grade for uranium. They can separate and reprocess materials as long as they don't use them for a nuclear weapons program. And Iran, in the last few years, has from time to time made threats that it's going to build nuclear submarines and go beyond, go up into high HEU or high LEU to power its nuclear submarines. These are sort of weird arguments in a way. You know, you can argue about a lot of these things. The only country which has, the only non-nuclear weapon state that we know of under the NPT that has a nuclear submarine program is Brazil. And the agency is having a difficult time trying to figure out how to allow Brazil to withdraw material from safeguarding, put it in a submarine, and then presumably return it to safeguards once that fuel comes out of a submarine. They don't like to talk about that very much, and they're very uncertain as to how that's going to go. The other country that has nuclear submarines, which is not a nuclear weapons state under the NPT, is India. India leased, like going to Hertz Rent-A-Car, they went and they leased a nuclear submarine from the former Soviet Union. That submarine came with a crew of Soviet officers and sailors who ran the engineering plant. The Indians were not allowed in the engineering plant They got to run the boat, but without the engineering, without being in the engineering area. More recently, they leased a boat from the Russian Federation. There was not a restriction of them being in the engineering plant. And then their nuclear submarine, the first one that they launched, and then about a year ago it sank pierside and did a lot of damage to it. It's still not, surprisingly, it looks just about like the Russian submarine which they had leased. Obviously they reverse engineered a lot of things in building their submarine. So you have these, what some people will call loopholes to the NPT for military uses, but basically your INFCIRC 153 deals with declared facilities. It deals with how to keep track of these materials, and everyone thought that things were going along pretty well with the system. And then along came a number of things that caused problems. We'll get to some of those in a minute. But first, I had stumbled in, I was talking about a significant quantity. This is defined by the IAEA. There's some confusion about this because a lot of people confuse significant quantity with the minimum amount of nuclear material required for a nuclear weapon. Under the definition from the IAEA, it's a term that's defined for the nuclear materials, uranium-233, 235, plutonium. It has different physical forms. It's basically an amount that if you have it separated, the IAEA will assume that you have enough material for a nuclear weapons program. That could be building 1, 2, whatever it is, weapons. It is a technical term originally, but it has become politicized. The reason it's become political is because the inspection frequency, which the IAEA does for safeguards inspections, is tied to the detection of the diversion of an SQ, of a significant quantity. If the SQ, and let's throw out the numbers, I think it shows up on the next slide. If the SQ for plutonium is 8 kilograms, and you have reprocessing facilities in a country that can reprocess spent fuel to extract plutonium, then your inspection frequency has to be frequent enough that you can detect the diversion of 8 kilograms. If you drop that inspection frequency, if you drop that SQ definition to 4 kilograms, then they'd have to inspect twice as frequently. And they just don't have the resources to do inspections at those kinds of intervals. So it's become somewhat a political number, because Department of Energy will tell you that, and they don't like to say this, but they have made public statements about this, that you can build a plutonium weapon with as little as 4 kilograms of plutonium. Now that's weapons grade plutonium versus reactor grade plutonium. That's another argument which is kind of beyond the scope of what we're talking about. But notice that the safeguards system is designed to detect the diversion, not prevent it. Now it may have a detrimental effect on people wanting to divert material because if the diversion is detected, obviously some bad things could happen to the country that, excuse me, that is doing that. But it's not a prevention regime. It's not a security regime. The safeguards inspectors, when they come to a facility, they don't check what the security forces do. They don't even check. They might note it in a report if they came and found, everything open and unlocked and the fence is all broken or whatever. But all they care about is that the material is there. So hopefully INFCIRC 153 has a deterrent effect, but because of this definition of significant quantity, it is quite possible that a non-nuclear weapon state could divert and actually maybe build a weapon if they were capable of doing that in the period between inspections, because as I said, the inspection frequencies are designed for old style nuclear weapons concepts. So is the source material and special fissionable material definitions. These come from the ideas about weapons from the 1950s. So safeguards is also tied, as we mentioned, to the Nuclear Suppliers Group. There's also the Zanger Committee, which looks at dual use. Both have ties to IAEA safeguards. We talked about the US-India agreement. The US has what we call 123 bilateral agreements. That's because this is out of Section 123 of the Atomic Energy Act, not because it's a simple counting number. It's actually a section number. We have, I think it's around 25 of these agreements with various countries where we provide nuclear, sometimes nuclear material, reactor fuel, that sort of thing, technical things, reactor components, maybe even full reactors. We don't do very much of that anymore. So let's keep going here.
Question, sir.
Yes.
So how often the IAEA inspectors inspect a country or a state?
I think it's better to think of how often they inspect a facility within a state. Mm-hmm. And they do that in a facility based on what their understanding is of the capacity of that individual facility. So they might be on a 6-month interval, they might be on a year interval, they might be on a 2-year interval. The IAEA has a fairly limited budget. For the entire agency, the budget is about what a sophisticated military aircraft costs. We're not talking billions of dollars here. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars, probably around 600 or 700 million dollars or euro is the annual budget of the agency. They really can't afford to do a lot of the inspections which they'd like to do. One of the previous DGs for safeguards said, look, what we've got to do is we've got to prioritize these. We've got to think about the countries that we think are likely to proliferate. We've got to really concentrate on getting our inspectors in there and doing a really good job. Let's not, maybe for a couple of years we can let those sneaky Canadians off a bit so that we don't have to be in Canada inspecting those facilities as frequently as we're inspecting things in other places. Well, what happened when they said that? When the DG said that, that was Knackerts, who was from Belgium. He's a couple of DGs ago. And there was a great hue and cry from those countries, which would have been the focus of that, saying, you're picking on us. This is not fair. The regime is supposed to inspect everybody. And so they're trying to inspect everybody, but they're really very limited as to how many inspectors they can afford and how they can do things. One solution to some of this was to simplify things in states which did not have a lot of nuclear material holdings. In other words, if you're a country which has a university that has, 100 grams of highly enriched uranium for scientific purposes, why should you have to go through all the same stuff that a country that has, like Japan, that has enrichment facilities, that has massive reprocessing facilities? Why should you have to go through all that? So there was a small quantities protocol, which was developed under GovInf. Remember, that's one of the Board of Governors documents, 276. It eliminates a lot of the paperwork. They still have to keep track of things, but their reporting criteria are much less. And basically, the inspections are few and far between under the small quantities protocol. There's a revision to the small quantities protocol, which increases a little bit the burden on the states, but there's still, it's still a very limited amount that those states have to do. And that cut down a lot on the inspector's workload, but they're still very overloaded. If you're an IAEA inspector, those people are out of their offices doing inspections more than 50% of the time during a year. Now, there are a lot of people who love to do that. They love to be out and traveling. They don't have a lot of family commitments, and they like to be out in the various countries. I learned early on in my tour of the 5 years I spent at the IAEA, never to travel with inspectors. inspectors draw a lot of per diem, and they look at that as supplemental income. So they always stay at the cheapest possible places in any country where you're at. And when I was in Azerbaijan with one of the inspectors, I wound up staying in a hotel which had a dirt floor. And I thought, this is a little extreme. You know, we could afford to pay more than $10 a night to stay in a place that at least had a floor. Anyway, that's kind of an aside. So you've got the small quantities protocol. All of a sudden, things exploded. Partly because of AQ Khan, partly because we suddenly started finding out that a lot of countries had nuclear weapons programs despite safeguards. And the system was being gamed. And the 153 inspection regime might not work. For example, in Iraq, inspectors went to the Tuatha site. They'd say, oh, hey, what about that building over there? And the Iraqis would say, sorry, that's not a declared facility. You can't go in there. And that's where they were doing their real nuclear weapons work. So in the wake of all of this, in the wake of our incursions into Iraq, Kuwait, etc., and our, Muammar Gaddafi, much to his later regret, I assume, gave up his nuclear weapons program. And inspectors went into Libya. South Africa gave up its weapons program. People went into South Africa. And North Korea just bailed out of the NPT and safeguards regime, but it had been doing a lot of work along the way. I actually worked with a guy who had found the North Koreans cheating. He was a Russian citizen. He was head of Asian inspections, and he caught them, found evidence that they were reprocessing and separating plutonium. And he told me that he thought he was not going to get out of the country alive, that he was going to get killed. But he got back, he had his samples, and he brought them back. And that led to the North Koreans just saying, well, we're not going to do this anymore. But it was an interesting story that he told, because he found this in a glove box in a lab. The North Koreans realized right away what he had done, because he started taking swipe samples and bagging them up. They sounded an emergency alarm, said that the facility had a emergency criteria that everybody had to evacuate. So he evacuated with the people. He went back the next day. The room in which they had 3 or 4 glove boxes, the glove boxes were gone. The walls had been replastered and painted. And everybody said, we don't know what you found yesterday, but it certainly wasn't here. Anyway, these things happen. So what was then created was what we now know as the Model Additional Protocol, INFCIRC 540. It expands what the state must provide information, allows for inspection of the total fuel cycle, allows for short notice inspections, allows for environmental sampling. Environmental sampling is new. That's a very important part of INFCIRC 540. But if you talk to the people who actually wrote INFCIRC 540, there was always the provision under 153, but it was never really used to do short notice inspections. But all of this under the Model Additional Protocol, and even under 153, the agency started changing its focus, not just to look at facilities, but to look at the state level. That's the whole country. And develop a way of reporting to, each year they make a report to the UN Security Council, and they now make it based on what they can say about the entire state, not just about facilities in that state. And they make, you can read the details, they make reports that say, we can or we can't be certain that this state is keeping all of its material in civilian use and is all safeguarded. That gets to be very technical.
Excuse me?
Yes.
I was wondering, what are the repercussions for a country like North Korea deciding to just back out?
So far, nothing. I mean, there are sanctions against North Korea. North Korea evades the sanctions. North Korea has probably assisted proliferation in other countries. They tend to perhaps trade nuclear weapons knowledge and information for things that get them around some of the sanctions. Our prior director of our Vienna office, Monterey, I'm at the James Martin Institute. We have an office in Vienna that runs in conjunction with the Austrian government. Our prior director there, Laura Rockwood, who's now running an independent GPO, she was the head of legal affairs, and she actually drafted the model additional protocol. She's quite an expert in that. So if you read something by Laura Rockwood, you'll get a good impression, you'll get a first-hand view by the person who wrote it of what this means. When El-Baradei and when Amano would go to Iran, up until Laura retired from the agency about 4 years ago. And you would always see pictures of the group going, and standing right behind the Director General would be Laura Rockwood. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I encourage you guys to jump in with questions. I feel like I'm kind of talking to my computer here, and it's, it's not unnerving, but I'm not sure how much is getting across and whether the pace is right for people. So how do the safeguards people implement the whole safeguards regime? As I said, the states make declarations about what they have, and then they start inspections. And then things are tracked. Sometimes the inspectors will put tamper-resistant seals on fresh fuel or something that's not going to be used. And then the next time they go back, they'll inspect to see if the seals are there. They may look at Cherenkov radiation from spent fuel assemblies at a power plant in the pool. There are a lot of technical means that they use to verify what they find in the accounting logs. The accounting logs are supposed to, each material balance area is supposed to state what's in that area. The inspector should be able to go into that area and passively, using radiation detectors, using other things, maybe just even simple scales, determine that what was declared to be there is there. Now the material may move from one material balance area to another, and they look at those records, then they check the other areas. So a lot of stuff is done by non-destructive assaying methods. Inspectors receive about a year of training. They may not be the most technical people, but they're trained to handle the equipment. And there's also a real-time monitoring that's set up. By that, it means that there's, and sometimes direct linkage back to the IAEA cameras that are focused on areas that would detect if there was anything untoward going on in that area. And now more recently, the IAEA has engaged in what we would call intelligence-like activities. In part of the state-level concept, they look at overhead satellite information. They can also take in information from member states, but when that information, let's say it's intelligence information, let's say the CIA has some suspicion about proliferation activities in Iran. If they give that information to the agency, then that becomes public information. It's not protected. It loses its intelligence classification. And that sort of thing is done, and it's done by intelligence agencies and security agencies in a number of states that provide information to the IAEA. It's always looked upon with some suspicion. If you read about the IAEA, you'll find that there are groups like China and the G77, which, they are always suspicious of anything given by the nuclear weapon states to the IAEA. China in itself is kind of an odd participant in the IAEA. Up until a couple of years ago, China really, although they were a member, and had a huge economy and a lot of assets, they acted like they were essentially a third world country in participating in the IAEA. One of the things that used to bug me or upset me a little bit was at the IAEA, when you have like an open technical meeting essentially for the non-nuclear weapon states, you have to pay for their one or two of their representatives to come. And that can be, usually figure a budget of maybe 5,000 euro per person. China never paid for any of their people. We had to pay for them out of the IAEA budget. And I always thought that was pretty ridiculous given the economy in China. That's changing now. China's becoming more of a good player in these efforts. They're also beginning to provide some cost-free experts to the agency and more funding. There are countries which provide a disproportional amount of funding to the agency. Each member state is assessed based on what is felt to be their fair share. Up until a few years ago, maybe 10 years ago, the US was a major contributor to the IAEA. In recent years, the EU has been the more significant contributor, but there are countries like Norway and Canada which contribute far in excess of what they're required to do. They're kind of nuclear-wise good citizens, maybe. They have their own reasons for doing that, but it's a fact that they do more than their fair share. Okay, let's finish this up here. We're beginning to run out of time. Contribution of safeguards to nonproliferation doesn't prevent proliferation. Raises awareness. When North Korea backed out, then everybody knew that they were going to embark on a nuclear weapons program. The loopholes we mentioned, we've kind of beaten to death this thing about it's not a loophole that non-weapons military use is allowed. One of the things that is maybe a problem, it's not a loophole, the safeguards doesn't do anything with regard to non-state actors. And in fact, right now, one of the problems that the agency has is how to deal with the Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, areas which have been taken over by the Russian Federation. The agency is not political. They're not going to say, okay, well, we got to deal with the Russian Federation on, there is at least one reactor, a research reactor in Crimea, and that's kind of up in the air now, and that's not a good thing. We don't think, honestly, we don't think that that there's any problems with that. We think that when the Russians went in there, Rosatom took control of that reactor, just like Rosatom controls things in the Russian Federation. It's a little more problematic, not for nuclear materials, but for other radioactive materials in the eastern part of the Ukraine. At the last Nuclear Security Summit, which I guess was in 2016 or 18, I can't remember, the Ukrainians made a presentation. They said, look, we've lost control of about 1,800 sources, some of which are large, in Eastern Ukraine. We just don't know where they are, whether they're under control or not. And that's not a good thing. Okay, safeguards isn't safety and it isn't security. Both are separate IAEA programs. Safeguards is mandatory, safety and security are not. There's a little bit of an exception to that if a country does not adhere to safety guidance, IAEA safety guidance, they're not supposed to be able to receive technical cooperation benefits from the IAEA. Now that is really not enforced that much, because what happens is the agency says, oh, you're not complying with safeguards guidance. We'll give you technical cooperation help in order to bring you up to speed so that you are in compliance with the safety guidance. I think that's a better way of approaching it, rather than saying, hey, you're not doing the right thing, so we're not going to help you. It's much better to help the countries that need help. We mentioned that safeguards has its own classification system. This is like a military classification system or State Department classifications, safeguards confidential, safeguards secret, safeguards top secret, and it doesn't, that material doesn't not go out of safeguards, other than safeguards employees who might leak it to their own governments, unfortunately.
Another question.
Sure.
What happens if the IAEA detects that a country, that the accounting of the nuclear material for a given country doesn't add up to the proper value? What do they do? Do they release an official report or what?
They report that, yes, they do make a report of that to the Security Council. And there are a number of states, I mean, a report about Egypt a number of years ago, and it turned out that there were some people at a university who decided to do separation experiments and separate plutonium. And they never reported that. The IAEA inspectors discovered that. There have been a number of small things like that, not huge stuff, but any non-compliance is reported to the Security Council. And when I say any, I don't mean exactly any. I mean, the DG makes a determination as to whether this is a serious problem and whether it's deliberate or inadvertent, and there's some discretion involved in that. But it's tending now towards any, because I guess for a number of reasons, maybe it's more correct to do that with any. Another thing, and this is kind of a little bit off because it's not safeguards, the agency has a code of conduct for radioactive sources. And there's a lot of talk about how many states comply with that, how many states have declared that they're complying with the code of conduct for radioactive sources. You need to look at the code itself. It only covers sealed sources. It doesn't cover radioactive material. It just covers radioactive material that's actually been sealed up in a source. The IAEA has 5 categories, which we'll talk about just to finish up here in a minute. And it only covers the first 3 categories of the 5 categories. It doesn't cover some of the stuff that's most commonly lost and stolen around the world. Okay, let's keep going. This is the categorization table that's used by the IAEA. This comes from a document called RSG 1.9. There are 5 levels of categories. The agency developed in RSG 0.9 a D value, that's a denominator in this A over D activity ratio, a D value for each of the radionuclides that you would find in normal commercial use. In other words, there may be 250 radioactive radionuclides. Realistically, there might be 30 or 40 that you have to worry about. They're all tabulated in RSG 0.9, the ones you have to worry about. And a D value, which some people refer to as a danger value, is given for each in terms of either curies or terabecquerel. In other words, it's either you have a D value, might be 2 curies, or it might be the equivalent in terabecquerel, which is something times 10 to the minus 2 terabecquerels, because terabecquerels are 10 to the 12th becquerels, and that system drives me nuts because I don't think in big numbers like that. I think in curies. So if you have an activity of a source in curies, and this is only for radioactive material, this is not for nuclear material. That's a different categorization scheme, which we'll talk about briefly in a second. Let's say I had a 100 curie source of iridium-192, which is fairly typical for a radiographic camera. I happen to know that the D value for iridium-192 is 2 curies. So I take the A value of 100, divide by the D value of 2, and even in my head, I can figure out that that's 50. And that would put that into this A over D category in category 2. This is a way of looking at how dangerous something is. The category 1 sources are the most dangerous, the category 5, the least dangerous. There are a lot of category 4 sources out there that, like moisture density gauges, which are commonly used in construction, and these are lost, stolen, whatever, sometimes intentionally, most of the time inadvertently. Your typical driver has these chained in the back of a pickup truck and he stops at 7-Eleven for a Slurpee or a big gulp or whatever he's getting. And when he comes out, his truck is gone and the source is in it. Whether that was stolen because they wanted the source or whether they wanted the truck most of the times is an open issue, but often you find that when people steal one of these sources, they're kept in boxes that make them look like an expensive set of tools. They open it up, find out that there's radiation stickers on things, and they sometimes just throw it by the side of the road because they don't want to deal with it. Many times we've found discarded sources. What's new in this is because these have now become so commonplace in construction, we're now seeing them being stolen intentionally, not for any nefarious purpose, but because somebody wants to use them in their construction business. And they either don't have a license or don't have the money to buy a source legally, and they steal one. Anyway, that's the way IAEA categorizes Arabic 1 through 5 for other radioactive material. This is the way nuclear material is categorized. And it's categorized by what the material is and its physical form. It's categorized by its mass. So if you have plutonium, and if you read the footnote A, it eliminates plutonium, which is more than 80% plutonium-238, and you have 2 kilograms of it, it's category 1. If you have less than 2 kilograms, etc., I mean, you can read the table. This sets out these categories in Roman numerals. And that can be important because I've seen many, particularly newspaper reporters, report things as category 1 in Arabic numbers, and what they're really talking about is a category 1 source or a category 2 source that's nuclear material. You have to read the footnotes for all of these. As I said, that first footnote deals with material in excess of 80%. Anybody know why that might be there? Why that's not covered? Hearing nothing, let me tell you. We make in our space program RTGs, radioisotopic thermal generators, or nuclear batteries. The Apollo moon missions all carried RTGs. You can only get so much power density out of solar panels, so the next step up is RTGs, and the step beyond that is actually nuclear reactors. Most people don't know that there are a number of nuclear reactors still in space. They're up in parking orbits now to decay away. The Russians used to shoot a lot of them into space. Actually, after the Soviet Union collapsed, or I should say the Soviets, did a lot of these. They had radar ocean reconnaissance satellites that flew in low Earth orbit. The reactors operated to power the radar systems because you couldn't do that with solar power, couldn't do that well with RTGs. You had to fly in low Earth orbit to get satisfactory returns from the radar. And once the useful life was over, these were to boost up into a high parking orbit. Sometimes they did not. If you look up Cosmos 954, if you Google that, you'll find a Soviet Romashka reactor, which came out of orbit, never boosted, came out of low Earth orbit and spread itself in a swath about 200 miles long over the Great Slave Lake in Canada. This is a joint Canadian-US recovery team. It was very clear what happened. Everybody, our people and other people around the world tracked this, saw the orbit degrade. We actually recovered parts of the reactor, and the Soviet response in those days was, what reactor? We don't know anything about a reactor in space. If it is, it isn't ours. And that's been typical more recently of some Russian responses about things, unfortunately. So you have to look at this, you have to look at the table, you have to understand how this categorizes nuclear material. This is the same table in the Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material and in INFCIRC 225 revision 5 and all the previous revisions that it's guidance from. It's one of the earliest nuclear security documents. The security, if you read how you secure the materials, you start with category 3 and you say category 3 material or facility containing category 3 material has to have the following security features. Might be guards, fences, locks, whatever. And then it says for category 2, you have to have all the stuff for category 3 plus the following. And then for category 1, it says you got to have everything for category 2 plus the following. So this is the way the guidance is set up as to how to secure and keep safe various nuclear material. There's one big difference in between the CPP&M and the INFCIRC 225. And actually this document, if you read footnote C, you'll find there's a reference to thorium. And so this comes from INFCIRC 225, which is guidance. The CPP&M, thorium is eliminated, probably because India, which has a lot of thorium assets, would not sign but for that. So anyway, the JCPOA, the IAEA was tasked with doing a lot of stuff under the JCPOA, which it had not done before. You know, it's now inspecting centrifuges for design characteristics. That's not something the IAEA had done before. The IAEA, in inspecting Iran, looked at, you know, what inventory they had of uranium hexafluoride, how it was processed, what enrichment level it was, but not, you know, what they were doing in terms of design. So there's a lot of things under the JCPOA that the IAEA is now doing, which it was never designed to do, really. When the JCPOA first came out, a speaker that I used in a course down here in Monterey, a great guy, he was head of training, safeguards training at the IAEA. He used to say, I don't know what the JCPOA is, but I know it's not safeguards because it's so different. It's such a different regime. Mentioned earlier on that I'd written a paper recently, not a very long paper, and it's about the potential impact of coronavirus on IAEA inspections in Iran and whether this can cause problems under the JCPOA. And if you were really cynical, could Iran take advantage of this virus if the inspectors can't come in because the IAEA won't let them come in, or Iran says stay out because there's a health issue and there's a danger? Would this give them enough time to break out and create a nuclear weapons program? Or not create a nuclear weapons program, produce enough material for them to have a bomb? And, you know, that's probably very unlikely, but you have to consider the possibilities. And kind of the conclusion in the paper was we need to support the IAEA in keeping the inspectors healthy, but also getting them into Iran. I mean, if people can go into Ebola regions and be safe, inspectors should be able to go into Iran and be safe, even if Iran is crawling with coronavirus. Okay, that's all I have for you. You'll have copies of this open for questions. Anybody want to talk about how you become an inspector or an employee of the IAEA or anything like that? I'll be glad to answer those questions too.
Hi, Professor Moore. I have a question for you about Saudi Arabia and how they're moving into a nuclear program but still have a small quantities protocol. Is there something going on in the background about that?
I don't know. The bottom line answer is I don't know. I know who knows, but I'll ask him. If you shoot me an email, my email address is gmoore@middlebury.edu. I'll be glad to get an answer for you and get back to you.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Do you feel like the IAEA has enough monetary resources as more countries begin to potentially pursue nuclear proliferation, especially with the limited number of inspectors?
No, and it's even worse than I depicted because, for example, in nuclear security, only about less than half, the number floats around a bit, but it's probably still less than half of the budget is from the regular IAEA budget. The rest is made up with what's called the Nuclear Security Fund, which are voluntary contributions from various countries. So that makes the head of nuclear security, and we've only had a couple of them. The current one is Raja Adnan Raja from Malaysia. Prior to him, it was Kamar Murabit from Morocco, and prior to Kamar was Anita Nilsson from Sweden. And those three people, as the principal nuclear security person at the IAEA, were actually like the beggar in chief. They had to go out hat in hand to the various countries and say, please support us, please support the Nuclear Security Fund. Some countries, as I mentioned, are very good about doing that out of proportion to what they do. But unfortunately, some of that money comes with strings attached. So you might say that, okay, well, we've got 20 million euro in the Nuclear Security Fund, but when you look at it, 15 of that might be only for use in sub-Saharan Africa. And that may not be where the need is. So it's a system which really needs to be revamped. The world should be willing to spend a heck of a lot more money on nuclear safety, nuclear security, and nuclear inspections. It is not, if you go to the kind of the person on the street, they tend to think of the IAEA as an international regulator. It is not a regulator at all. It has no enforcement powers. It can't shut down reactors or close weapons programs or do anything like that. Its only clout is to go to the Security Council and say, this is what we find. And then it's up to the Security Council. And so far, the Security Council maybe has not been the most willing to act based on what the IAEA has told them. Now, having said that, I mean, you know, there were sanctions imposed on Iran. Sanctions are still imposed on Iran. My personal feeling is I think it's a tragedy that we got out of the JCPOA. The JCPOA was not a perfect agreement, but it was probably the best the Obama administration was going to be able to get with the Iranians. And, you know, if we'd worked properly, maybe we could have gotten, you know, done things more cooperatively. I'm hoping that now, you know, maybe something good can come out of this coronavirus, and maybe we can help the Iranians health-wise, and maybe that will, you know, it would be nice if that would lead to more cooperation. Because it's like almost everything else internationally. It's more a clash between governments than it is within people. I dealt with a lot of Iranians when I was at the IAEA. I can't think of an exception. They were good people. They were talented people. They were very well trained. A woman I used to know when I was at Livermore Lab used to say, I know everybody in the Iranian nuclear weapons program. I went to school with all of them at MIT. And that was probably true. You know, they're a lot closer to us than the governments are. That's kind of soapboxy, but I'm sorry. Other questions? Michael, how are we doing on time for your?
Hey, great. We're coming in for a landing here.
Okay.
And everything is stable. The runway's not moving around. Everything's good.
Sounds like Louis Alvarez.
Okay, well, I hope the class got a lot out of what you conveyed, Dr. Moore. It has been a very rich discussion.